I don't know about you, but I've never met anyone who's not happy when seeing waterfall. Waterfall photography that can be very beautiful if it's done right. You want a waterfall to look like this instead of like this one right here. So if you're interested only in the camera settings that I use to shot my waterfall shots, go straight to this timeline right here. However, I recommend you to stick around because I'm gonna cover step by step what things that I bring when shooting waterfall and my thought process in getting that waterfall shot. Intro. Okay, so first things first, I'm gonna cover the 6 things that I bring when I'm out shooting waterfalls. Obviously, everyone's different. You might have different checklists, but this is just how I handle it, going by my experience. The first thing is obviously you will need a camera. The camera can be a DSLR, it can be mirrorless just like this one. It can even be mobile phones, as long as your camera can do manual mode. So as you know, I shoot with Nikon. So I've got the Z50 that I carry in my bag all the time because it's like very tiny and compact. But I also have this Nikon Z6 that I'm filming with right now. So item number 2 is a tripod. This is my tripod, the Benro carbon fiber. I'm using the studded legs here just because when you're out shooting photography for waterfalls, the surface can be very muddy and can be slippery. So having those studded legs really help. And why tripod is very important, because when we doing the waterfall photography, we're talking about long exposure photography here. You won't be able to hold your camera still for 1 second, let alone 5 seconds. Now you might be thinking that, well, I can just find somewhere nice, safe, you know, and flat. I can lay the camera down like that. Yes, you're right. You are definitely right. But the chances for you to find somewhere that is flat, nice, stable, safe, that you can lean the camera down like this, without any risk, it is almost impossible when you're out in the bush, in the waterfall. So that's why the tripod is very important. Oh, one thing that's worth to mention, make sure your tripod has a quick release plate on it. It happened to me once, brought the tripod, no quick release, no good shots. Okay, items number 3, bring the lens that's suitable to location where you're going to, and also attach the lens to the camera from the get-go. When I'm out shooting waterfalls, I'll try to minimize, if I can, as much as I can, not to swap lens on the field because it can be too muddy, can be too wet, it might not be safe for your camera and for your lens. And the lenses that I'm using most of the time is 14 to 24 f2.8 and the Z lens that I'm using right now, which is 24 to 70 2.8. But depending on the location that you're going to, you might want to use 35mm lens. You might want to use a compressed 50mm lens if that's more suitable for you. So whatever the lens that you think is more suitable, have it slapped on a camera, ready to go from the get-go. Alright, items number 4, very important to bring, is the ND filter. So even though this is optional, you're going to find this very helpful. Even in low light situations, sometimes no matter how low your ISO has been, no matter how small your aperture has been, you're still gonna find the scene to be too bright. So this is why you need this ND filter and slap it in front of your lens. This is basically just like sunnies to your lenses, really. So now item number 5 that I bring is this remote shutter trigger. As the name suggested, this is a shutter trigger. So I don't have to touch my camera when I'm taking the shot because I don't want to introduce any micro movement to the camera as the shot's taken. This is why I'm using this. If you don't have the remote trigger, no problem. You can just set your camera to the timer mode. Problem solved. Items number 6 is microfiber cloth. I've got a large one. Why I need this microfiber clothes is because when you're out shooting waterfalls, you are likely to cope a bit of a wet from the mist. Maybe you're shooting under the wet weather. This will help to dry your lens or just dry your camera in general. And this can be the difference between the unusable photos, and the great shots. Now, the last item, I said that I had 6. This is actually a bonus item that I bring. First aid kit. Self-explanatory. Depending on where you're going, sometimes the waterfall can be just like 100 meters down from the car park, which is nice and sweet. Sometimes you need to walk several kilometers to get to the waterfall. And sometimes the place that you're going might not have any phone reception. This kit is very light, it's fairly compact, and it can make a very big difference when needed. So now that you know what I bring during the waterfall shoot, now let's get to the second point, safety. I've talked about this before, I can't emphasize that enough, safety first. Waterfall photography comes with risk, flash flooding, slippery rocks, fallen rocks, you name it. So take a good care when you're going, go with a friend is recommended, look after one another, and you just don't want to break your gears or worse, hurt yourself. Safety first.
Okay guys, the next tips, when you come to shoot waterfalls, come in when the light is right. I know this is the general rule for landscape anyway, but specifically for waterfalls, you don't want the contrast to be too high. Because if you're shooting in the middle of the day, the sun can reflect a lot of highlights from the water and make the foreground looks very dark. So it's not ideal. So you want the foreground and the background have nice even lights.
So ideally shoot early in the morning or late in the afternoon, or ideally when the sun's not shining directly to the water. Here's the next tips. Once you get to the location of the waterfalls, before you do anything else, observe the location. And I'm not saying this from a safety standpoint as well, but also from the composition standpoint. I know that when confronted with that such beautiful, nice view, it's so easy to get excited, mount the camera to the tripod and start shooting. But I would recommend you just to take a deep breath, embrace the beauty of the falls, and observe the location. You might want to assess if there's any obstacles, if there's any dangerous slippery rocks to get to the place that you think gonna be a good composition. You might want to look at any beautiful foreground. So observe the location before you start slapping your camera to the tripod and start shooting. Now tips number 5 is find a great composition. So do not just shoot waterfalls straight up, only the waterfalls. You want to incorporate foreground. Now if you are asking what can be the foreground, there's a lot can be foreground. For example, these leaves right here, this can be a nice foreground. And another example as well, these boulders with moss, these can be a nice foreground. And this log right here, this can be a nice foreground. Leading lines that help to the composition. So there's a lot, if you look around, there's so much you can actually use as the foreground. Also, if you've got someone that can pose near the waterfall safely, then use that, because having a person in that waterfall shoot, that adds a sense of scale of that waterfalls. And if that person happens to have a bright colored jacket or bright shirt, that can also make the person pop in the photos. Not that kind of pop, but I mean it stands out. And it's gonna add the entirety of the photo look more appealing. Okay, camera settings. This is the questions a lot of people ask. Some people are just not interested in all those wishy-washy, all those tips that I've delivered previously. They just want to go straight to the camera settings, and it's okay. So let's get into the camera settings. Now my thought process when it comes down to camera settings when shooting waterfalls is shutter speed. That comes first. I'll tell you why in a sec. And then aperture, then ISO the last. Alright, why shutter speed comes first? Because it really depends on my intention, what I want to capture. If I want to capture the water to be looking very misty, softy and silky smooth looking, then I'm gonna use a longer shutter speed. It might be between 2 to 5 seconds, sometimes it might be 10 seconds. Now if the intention is to catch the water movement, whether that's a whirlpool that happens in the foreground or the falls, or maybe that's the water that's cascading down, you want to have that details of the water movement while still have the water looking very smooth. I am likely to shoot at 1/5 of a second up to 1 second max. So that's why the shutter speed is the #1 factor to convey how you want the scene to look like, how you want the water flow to look like, whether that's misty, nice, silky, smooth, or whether that's striky and have more details in the flow. That makes sense, right? That makes sense. Now let's get into the aperture. I often shoot between f5.6 to f8. That's sort of my sweet spot to me. But if I then, for whatever reason, I forgot my ND filter, which had happened, then I had no option to shoot at f22 or f29 depending on your lens and the lowest ISO in order to be able to compensate to have a slower shutter speed. And now the ISO. The ISO is probably the least important thing that I factor in for the waterfall shoots. I often shoot between ISO 100 to ISO 400 depending on lighting situation. So ISO's function here basically just to compensate my shutter speed and my aperture. So obviously these settings can change depending on the lighting situation on the day. If the day is getting darker, if the waterfall's hidden under the big canopy of trees, then you might want to go for ISO 800 or maybe a bit higher. Sometimes it does happen, not ideal, but it does happen. So that's why there's never be right or wrong. Just experiment with other settings other than what I've got here for you now. And one more thing that I noticed from shooting waterfalls, if the water volume from the falls is not too much, exposing the shutter for too long, that can actually make the water to look very thin and eventually sort of like disappearing from the scene. So you want to find that shutter speed sweet spot depending on the water flow as well. Alright guys, that's it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from it because that's my intention. Are you shooting the waterfall differently from what I do? If so, please let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, you know the drill. I'll leave it up to you. And thank you so much for watching again. Please make this world a better place. Peace.